Number 9. Lost vehicle. Crossing an unforgiving polar environment can be both time-consuming and life-threatening. Exploring these landscapes became much easier and safer with the invention of specially built vehicles designed for the intense conditions. But the earliest designs weren't exactly the greatest. One colossal failure of a machine ended up being abandoned simply because it was easier than trying to drive it anywhere. In 1937, the United States Antarctic Service Expedition brainstormed to figure out exactly what type of vehicle would be best for their exploration. They settled on plans for a massive machine they called the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Nicknamed the Penguin, it would be able to cruise across the continent's 5,000 miles, 8,047 kilometers of rugged terrain, while doubling as a living quarters for its 5-man crew. Explorer Thomas Poulter designed the 56-foot-long, 17-meter vehicle after becoming trapped at a remote Antarctic base, which made him realize the potential benefits of a mobile base. After 2 years of planning, the Antarctic Snow Cruiser was built in just 11 weeks. It housed a control cabin, machine shop, storage room, kitchen, and living quarters. Sort of like an Antarctic RV. Equipped with 2 powerful diesel engines, it reached speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, 48.3 kilometers per hour. The wheels on this gigantic beast measured 10 feet, 3 meters in diameter, and it was capable of raising and lowering its suspension. These features certainly made the Antarctic Snow Cruiser seem like it was capable of effortlessly gliding across the continent's surface even in the most inhospitable conditions. But the reality turned out to be much different. In fact, things fell apart right from the moment the vehicle arrived in Antarctica. First, it collapsed a wooden deck while disembarking from the ship that delivered it. Then it proved entirely useless in the snow and on the ice. The cruiser was too heavy, and its tires were too smooth, even with chains on them. It was so difficult to drive that its crew converted it into a stationary base after months of struggling with it. At the onset of World War II, the U.S. government summoned its personnel in the Antarctic for more pressing duties elsewhere. The Antarctic Snow Cruiser was abandoned and became buried in snow. It was rediscovered in 1958 when a crew saw its signal poles sticking up out of the snow. They dug it out using a bulldozer and left it in place. Since then, the Ross ice shelf has calved or split several times, dropping large icebergs into the sea. While passing by in 1963, a ship's crew noticed debris that might have belonged to the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. It's possible that the vehicle plunged to a watery grave during one of these calving events. 2 researchers are pretty certain that they've pinpointed its general location, but for now, its presence along the seafloor is only a theory. Number 8. A massive cargo plane. A C-130 Hercules cargo aircraft called Juliet Delta 321 took an unexpectedly long break from flying in late 1971 due to mechanical problems. The plane had just delivered supplies to a scientific expedition in Antarctica when one of the rockets used for takeoff malfunctioned. It crash-landed on the ice and its landing gear collapsed. Thankfully, nobody was injured, but recovering the plane would be too complicated and expensive. Juliet Delta 321 was stripped of its radios, instruments, and other navigational equipment and was abandoned at the crash site. Recovering the plane started to seem more realistic after 2 other C-130 planes were salvaged in Antarctica in the years immediately following the crash. Plans to retrieve Juliet Delta 321 were finally drawn up in 1986, 15 years after the accident. A 6-man crew spent 5 weeks digging the aircraft out from under 20 feet, 6.1 meters of snow. Then they removed the engines and sent them for repairs. The following season, another crew went to the plane and performed repairs on site. Juliet Delta 321 took to the skies again in early 1988, over 16 years after it came to a rest on the ice. Number 7. Giant prehistoric viruses. Let's face it, as the global COVID-19 pandemic rages on, many of us are far more terrified of viruses than we used to be, and with good reason. So it may seem kind of crazy that after discovering 2 huge ancient viruses in the Siberian permafrost, scientists wanted to bring them back to life. But that's exactly what they did in 2014 after discovering the prehistoric pathogens frozen 100 feet, 30.5 meters underground. Dubbed Pithovirus sibericum and Mollivirus sibericum, these so-called giant viruses are big enough to be seen under a standard microscope. They became infectious very quickly after they were revived. Thankfully, as single-celled organisms, they don't pose much of a threat to humans. But the study emphasized the sobering reality that we are not safe from ancient viruses and bacteria, especially as global temperatures rise and permafrost thaws, threatening to release the pathogens into the environment. This is especially concerning as climate change makes the Siberian shore more accessible to the drilling and mining industries. It's entirely possible that the first viruses to infect humans in the Arctic could re-emerge, as well as viruses that infected other hominins like the Neanderthals and other pre-human species. The ability to revive long-frozen viruses challenges the idea that a virus could possibly be eradicated from the planet. Society has developed a false sense of security when it comes to assuming things previously eradicated are no longer a threat. And we can now say that this is a lesson we've learned firsthand. Number 6. A missing man. Russia's Yakutia region is the coldest populated area on Earth. Even during the summer, temperatures can drop as low as -4 degrees Fahrenheit, -20 degrees Celsius. Winters are much more brutal. During the month of January, for example, the average temperature is -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius. When 45-year-old father of 3 Yegor Krivoshoppkin vanished in Yakutia in August, the outlook was grim. As the days turned into weeks, the odds of him being found alive grew extremely thin. When it comes to surviving in the harsh Siberian wilderness, the deck is stacked against even the most seasoned experts. Authorities gave up on their search after 6 weeks and told Krivoshoppkin's family that they needed to be realistic, that they needed to understand that it was almost impossible for him to still be alive. But they refused to give up hope and did everything in their power to try finding him. 2 months after disappearing, Krivoshoppkin appeared at a remote campsite belonging to a reindeer breeder. He was disoriented and confused and had somehow ended up 190 miles, 306 kilometers from where he vanished. He wasn't exactly frozen in the ice, but he might as well have been after sleeping under trees and wandering the Siberian tundra for weeks on end. The community was shocked to learn that Krivoshoppkin was alive and that he'd managed to avoid freezing to death or being eaten by bears or wolves. What's even more surprising is that frostbite is the only injury he seems to have sustained. Luckily, he's still able to walk. As of the last update, Krivoshoppkin was recovering at a hospital in stable condition. He told his sister that he had lost touch with reality and experienced blackouts as he traversed the terrain. He had survived on tinned food that had been dropped by Soviet aircraft some 40 years earlier. This was the second time the man went missing. 2 years earlier, he became disoriented by forest fires and got lost. Krivoshoppkin was found 2 months later, 75 miles, 121 kilometers from where he disappeared. Hopefully, it doesn't happen again, because he may not be so lucky next time. Number 5. Fecal fuel. Polar explorer Jürgen Brunlund died in a cave, frost-bitten and starving during an expedition to Greenland's northern coast in November 1907. The Greenland-born Inuit was the last member of the expedition's 3-man team to perish, and the only one whose remains were ever found. While he lay in the cave dying, Brunlund recorded his final thoughts in a diary containing a heavy black smudge on one of its pages. For a long time, experts were unable to determine what the material was. A recent analysis of the mysterious substance using new technology detected traces of oil, burned rubber, and feces, leading researchers to suspect that he desperately tried using anything he could to light a petroleum burner. But his attempts at obtaining life-saving warmth failed, and he succumbed to the harsh conditions he was trapped in. Brunlund met his face over inland ice during the team's return trip to the base camp. By the time he found shelter in the cave, expedition members Milius Eriksson and Niels Peter Høghagen had already died from exposure and exhaustion. The diary contains details about where the men's bodies were, but nobody ever found them. Another expedition discovered Brunlund's body and belongings in 1908. They buried him where he died and kept the diary, which, as you can see, researchers are still learning new things about to this day. What would you do if you became lost in a frozen landscape? Would you resort to using anything as fuel? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating videos. Number 4. Wreckage lost in time. In 1952, an Anchorage-bound U.S. Air Force cargo plane crashed into Alaska's Mount Gannet, claiming all 52 souls aboard. It was en route from Washington State when it ended up several miles off course. Civil Air Patrol Lieutenant Terrace Moore discovered the wreckage 6 days later. The plane was practically unrecognizable, with only its tail remaining intact. The crash had triggered a major avalanche which, combined with glacial movement, encased the plane in snow and ice. Within a year, over 50 feet, 15 meters of snow had piled on top of the wreck. Nobody saw the downed aircraft again until 2012, when an Army National Guard helicopter spotted debris while flying overhead. At first, officials assumed it was a crash that hadn't been reported yet, but a ground search revealed the plane's true identity. In the 60 years since it crashed, the wreckage had traveled 13 miles, 21 kilometers from where the accident occurred. A volunteer military crew recovered what they could during the 1 month it's safe to travel to the site. They amassed a growing collection of personal effects, including uniforms, dog tags, wedding rings, wallets, and more. The crew has also uncovered the remains of 37 people who died in the disaster. Airplane parts and artifacts continue to surface as the team painstakingly explored the wreck. Air Force officials blamed the crash on a pilot navigational error resulting from poor weather and unsophisticated instruments. Number 3. Resurrected worms. In 2018, scientists attempted to revive 2 species of microscopic nematode worms that were found in the Siberian permafrost. They had spent tens of thousands of years frozen in what researchers suspected was a state of suspended animation. The team analyzed 2 soil samples containing nematodes from different parts of Siberia. They separated and defrosted the females, and soon enough the worms were moving around. The experiment was a groundbreaking success, marking what the team described as the first known example of multicellular organisms returning to life after spending so long in a deep freeze. Nematodes are just 1 millimeter long on average. Such a small creature naturally doesn't seem very hardy, but they're incredibly resilient, as the study proved. Some are found living as far as 0.8 miles, 1.3 kilometers underground, deeper than any other multicellular organisms. And while nematodes are extremely adept at surviving in a variety of environments, their ability to come back to life over 30,000 years later was a serious game changer in our understanding of just how long some creatures can spend in suspended animation. Number 2. The Long Ago Person. Back in 1999, a group of Canadian sheep hunters discovered human remains on a melting glacier in British Columbia near the Yukon border. A walking stick, bones, and a fur garment lay nearby. The discoverers notified the authorities about the body, and representatives of the local Champagne and Aishihik First Nations territory reported to the scene. There, they found an incomplete male skeleton with a missing skull. They named him Kwade Dan Sinchi, which means long ago person found in their traditional language. The First Nations and the British Columbia government agreed to work together to study the body, ensuring that scientific research could be carried out while respecting indigenous values and customs. Researchers determined that Kwade Dan Sinchi lived around 1700 AD, or roughly 300 years ago. He was a young, healthy man between the ages of 17 and 22 when he died, indicating that an unexpected accident took his life. The iron blade knife and spear thrower discovered alongside him suggest he was a hunter. Kwade Dan Sinchi's other personal belongings included a robe made from 95 gopher skins, a beaver skin bag, a walking stick, and a spruce root hat. Digestive tract analysis showed that he ate beach asparagus and shellfish during his last hours, meaning he likely started his journey near salt water. In fact, he consumed shellfish for most of his life, only switching to meat a month or 2 before he perished. Scientists theorize that he grew up near a coast, spent some of his last months in Canada's interior, then once again relocated to the coast shortly before his death. DNA evidence traced Kwade Dan Sinchi to 17 of his living relatives, but researchers are uncertain of his journey's purpose and destination. In 2001, scientists returned the man's remains to the Champagne and Aishihik nations, who cremated him and returned the ashes to his original resting place. Number 1. Message in a bottle. In 1959, during a time when shrinking glaciers weren't a major focal point among scientists, American geologist Paul T. Walker developed a curiosity about the matter. He wanted to know if a glacier on Ward Hunt Island in Canada's high Arctic was retreating, but the only way to do that would be to revisit it in the future and take measurements. Since Walker knew he might not be back in the area anytime soon, he figured that maybe future visitors could help him out. He placed a handwritten message in a bottle, asking the reader to measure the distance between the glacier and the cairn that he left the bottle in. The note also requested for the person to mail the information to Walker's lab. Most of the geologist's contemporaries expected the glacier to grow, if anything. Walker was certainly unorthodox for entertaining the possibility that it could shrink. Little did his colleagues at the time know Walker's thinking was way ahead of their time. Sadly, the forward-thinking scientist passed away just months after he left the bottle, and his experiment was left unfinished. 54 years later, in 2013, researchers Warwick Vincent and Dennis Sarrazin found the bottle and its note. They honored the late geologist's wish and calculated that the glacier had retreated 233 feet, 71 meters, since 1954.
Number 10. Haunted San Antonio's Abandoned Asylum. In San Antonio, there is an abandoned asylum shrouded in mystery and rumor. The creepy and dilapidated buildings inspired wild stories, including rumors that doctors at the insane asylum went crazy and massacred some of the patients. But unfortunately for all you horror fans out there, these rumors are not actually true, and the supposed abandoned asylum was actually an old juvenile home for kids. The facility, called the Bexar County Juvenile Home for Boys, was built in 1915. At the time, this type of facility was called a poor farm. It was where poor, destitute boys who had no other place to go would be sent when they got caught misbehaving or breaking the law. By 1925, the juvenile home had a serious reputation for cruelty. Children inside the facility were so desperate to get out that one resorted to eating rat poison. In 1933, a staff member on site was convicted of murdering a 14-year-old who was in the facility's care after an argument. By 1996, all 4 of the structures were abandoned and left to rot. It was after its abandonment that people started assuming the creepy old building was an insane asylum. After all, the interior is horrifying, with metal bars, padded rooms, and all the atmosphere of what we imagine abandoned asylums to look like. Number 9. Reculver Towers. The Reculver Towers in England are the only structures that remain from what was once an ancient Saxon church. The church, called St. Mary's, was part of a Roman fortress guarding the Wonsum Channel. The fortress itself was built about 2,000 years ago in 210 AD, with the church coming later as an addition in 669. But it was demolished in 1809 because there were fears it would collapse into the sea. The only thing that remained were the 2 towers, the Reculver Towers, as they were needed as a landmark for shipping vessels. When ships returned, they used the towers to mark their position. In the Middle Ages, they even dipped their sails when they went past the church to show respect. But here's where the abandoned towers get creepy. It's said the church is haunted. Visitors of the towers at night have claimed to have heard children screaming and crying. There are also accounts of a monk, a galloping horse, and a middle-aged woman's ghost haunting the location. Many believe that the cries of the children are due to the several remains of children's bones discovered buried beneath the foundation in the 1960s, which could explain why the church's towers are still haunted to this day by their pitiful ghosts. Number 8. Abandoned Mining Complex. Hidden deep in the Ural Mountains, a dangerous mining complex from World War II era lies abandoned. The mining complex is a labyrinth of dark tunnels, poorly constructed in a hurry to supply the Russian armies, and were abandoned after the end of hostilities. Some of these tunnels are at risk of leaking gases such as methane and carbon dioxide, as well as hydrogen sulfide. Access to the tunnels is dangerous and frightening, with poorly constructed supports, collapsed sections, flooding, and other risks to anyone who dares enter. The place is a total disaster. Photographers have ventured into the mines to take incredible photos, showing the abandoned and rusted equipment simply left behind, collapsed sections of track, and other eerie and otherworldly remnants of the former mineral ore supply lines. Number 7. Chilean Ghost Town. Humberstone is a haunted ghost town located in Chile. If the name Humberstone sounds a little too British for a country where most of the country speaks Spanish, that's because it is. The town was named after a British chemical engineer named James Humberstone. James went to South America in 1875 and started a small mining town in the middle of the Atacama Desert, close to the border of both Peru and Bolivia. He mined saltpeter, which was used to make fertilizer. Up until the early part of the 20th century, just about all the saltpeter in the world came from the Atacama Desert. It was big business. At the time, the demand for saltpeter was so huge that it made up 60% of the fiscal revenue of the entire country of Chile. They literally lived off saltpeter. But alas, the boom came to an end. World War I broke out, and the Germans figured out how to create a synthetic substitute that could be used for fertilizer instead of saltpeter. Within just a few years, the entire saltpeter industry collapsed, and dozens of towns throughout the desert, just like Humberstone, were abandoned. But Humberstone still remains alone in the desert today, empty and sad, but still there as a desolate reminder of the era of Chile's saltpeter domination. Number 6. The Jetstar roller coaster. In 2012, devastating Hurricane Sandy ripped through the Atlantic, the largest and deadliest storm of that hurricane season. When it hit the coast of New Jersey, Sandy blew through Seaside Heights and devastated Casino Pier, the Seaside Heights amusement park. The Jetstar roller coaster was among the rides utterly destroyed. Before that, the roller coaster had been a famous and iconic sight at the Seaside Heights amusement park for around a decade. But Hurricane Sandy destroyed pretty much everything on the casino pier, tearing down all the rides like the log flume, the centrifuge, and Stillwalk Manor. The Jetstar was the only ride that remained visible above the waves after Sandy ripped the pier apart and dumped rides into the ocean. The site attracted tourists, anxious for photos of Sandy's devastation. It was a complete hazard that had the potential to fall down on any curious urban explorer trying to get photographs. But regardless of the danger, the Jetstar was a depressing icon for New Jersey. At least it was, before a dredging company began removing the ride from the water. Over the course of just a few days, a barge and crane ripped apart the old roller coaster and took it away to be buried in a scrap yard. Number 5. Memmingen Military Base. The Memmingen Military Base hasn't been used or touched in about 25 years. It's known by locals in Germany as the Forbidden City. The base is located roughly 20 miles from Berlin, originally used to house prisoners of war during World War I. In 1935, the base became the headquarters for the armed forces, meaning it was the military command center for the Nazis during World War II. After the war was over, the Soviets took the base for themselves and occupied it with 40,000 soldiers. But the Soviet Union eventually dissolved. By 1994, when the Soviets disintegrated, all the troops were gone from the Memmingen military base, and it was officially abandoned. 25 years on, and the base is still standing, more of a tomb than a military center now. Would you ever explore such a creepy military base, occupied by both the Nazis and the soldiers of the former USSR? Let us know how brave you are in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Number 4. Yuma Territorial Prison. The Yuma Territorial Prison sits on a bluff overlooking the Colorado River. Its history goes back to around 1849, when the town of Yuma began to experience a huge surge in immigrants crossing on the way to California. A military post was established. Then, when there was a gold rush in Yuma in 1858, Yuma County was born. The Territorial Prison came soon after in 1875, with a total budget of $25,000 for the project. It was because of all the gold, greed, and wild freedom of the West that the prison was ever needed in the first place. The first 7 inmates were put in the prison on July 1st, 1876. According to Arizona State Parks, among these criminals was the legendary stagecoach robber Pearl Hart. The prison continued to operate and house bad guys for 33 years. But then, because of overcrowding and a huge boom in crime, all inmates had to be moved to a new facility in Florence, and the Territorial Prison was abandoned. But just wait, because it wasn't abandoned forever. In the 1920s and 1930s, homeless people, and even homeless families ravaged by the Great Depression, moved into the cells at the prison. Then, in 1939, local residents raised enough funds to renovate the guard towers and turn the entire prison into a living museum. Number 3. Spooky Farmhouse. Photographer Brian Sansevero is known for exploring some of the creepiest abandoned places in the US. As a native of Long Island, he travels far and wide to explore the truly creepy places of the country. His most recent expedition had him traveling to a farmhouse in Maryland, a huge structure originally built in 1890. Brian uncovered a horse-drawn carriage in the barn, children's toys scattered across the floor from the 1900s, and the remnants of ordinary family life from between the 1800s and the 2000s. It was basically a time capsule showing off the last 200 years. How did Brian find the amazing farmhouse? Well, that's one of the secrets that he doesn't tell anyone. All he told the media was that the farmhouse was very difficult to locate, with the driveway so overgrown that you can't even see it from the road. Chances are it's so deep in Maryland that nobody even knows it's there. He believes it was probably abandoned in the 2000s, since there were some fairly modern objects in the house. But the creepy barn also had some bizarre vintage clothing, including a wedding dress from the 1950s. Number 2. St. Elmo. St. Elmo is one of the best preserved ghost towns anywhere in the American West. But that doesn't mean it's not a spooky place to visit, especially at night. It's located near Buena Vista, just 30 minutes from the nearest town. Amazingly, there are still 43 buildings in St. Elmo, including a courthouse and jail, private homes, and a good old-fashioned saloon. St. Elmo actually started as a forest city in the year 1880. By 1881, the town had 2,000 residents, most of them men. The town drew in silver miners and gold fiends. But when the train service to the area stopped in 1926, long after the gold boom had died, The town shriveled and vanished. By 1958, there was no one left. The town is still empty today, but now it's a tourist destination. The general store is open seasonally to provide souvenirs and snacks. You can rent a creepy cabin and spend the night. Word is that there are some people even trying to move into the city to bring it back to life. Number 1. Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane. The Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane is as terrifying as it sounds. It's located in New York, a collection of old Victorian buildings that are falling to pieces. And although we think about insane asylums today as places of torture and evil, back when this institution opened, it was supposed to be an alternative to the truly dark places where people with mental illnesses were sent. In the early part of the 19th century, if you didn't have somebody to care for you, and you suffered from an illness of the mind, you were sent to something called an almshouse. It was basically a shelter, almost definitely overcrowded and full of degenerates. It was the Surgeon General Dr. Sylvester D. Willard who proposed a hospital run by the state. 6 days before his death, Abraham Lincoln signed the proposal. That was how the Willard Asylum started. The first patient was welcomed in 1869. One of the first patients arrived at the hospital stuffed inside a chicken crate. Another was a girl who had been shackled in a cell since she was a young child. The asylum was clearly a better alternative to where they had been. But through the years, the hospital got worse and worse. What started as a good idea turned into a place of cruelty, where anyone with anything even slightly wrong with them was thrown into a cell and treated like a crazy person. The last patient was let out of the hospital in 1995, and it closed its doors forever. Today, things left behind by the staff can still be found in the creepy rooms.
Number 11. MV Kalakala. Shortly after entering service on the 4th of July in 1935, the iconic MV Kalakala ferry became the second most photographed object in the whole world. Known for its lovely Art Deco style and luxurious accommodations, the ship operated in Washington State's Puget Sound. In addition to offering ferry services, Kalakala was used for moonlight cruises, hosting a live dance orchestra. The vessel was voted second only to the Space Needle as a top attraction among visitors to the 1962 World's Fair. While its artsy appearance won people over, Kalakala's futuristic aircraft-inspired design was pretty impractical. The small wheelhouse offered poor visibility for the crew. Cars became wider after World War II, reducing the ferry's vehicle carrying capacity by 40% during post-war years. Passengers had an increasingly difficult time squeezing past cars as they boarded and disembarked from the ferry. The 1950s saw the development of more efficient vessels. By the end of the decade, the Kalakala was nearly obsolete. It was taken out of service in 1967 and briefly served as a crabbing vessel. Then it sat, abandoned, for a number of years before finally being scrapped in 2015. Still, it had a long life. Number 10. SS Valencia. Built in 1882, the SS Valencia was a passenger steamer that operated between San Francisco and Alaska. It wasn't very popular among the general public, who thought that the ship was far too small and felt it was overly exposed to the elements. It was also quite slow, earning it a second-class rating, and it navigated poorly during the winter. Valencia had a poor track record for safety. In 1902, she collided with another ship and was punctured. An investigation found that if the vessel had been damaged below the waterline, it would have capsized. Then, in 1905, she ran aground. Thankfully, nobody was injured. Bad weather set in during Valencia's final voyage in 1906, forcing its crew to rely on dead reckoning instead of navigating based on the position of celestial bodies in the sky. The ship struck a reef 11 miles, 18 kilometers off Vancouver Island, causing a huge gash in the hull. Water poured in, and the 108 passengers were loaded onto lifeboats. 3 lifeboats flipped while being lowered into the water, sending its occupants into the ocean. 2 other lifeboats disappeared, and another capsized. Only 9 people survived. The rest of the passengers drowned, were beaten to death by waves hitting the rocks, or died from hypothermia. 100 people, including women and children, died. For years after the disaster, fishermen and locals have claimed to see a phantom ship resembling the Valencia. Some witnesses reported seeing skeletons aboard, while others claimed they saw human-like figures clinging to the wreck for dear life. Number 9. Mary D. Hume. In 1881, a prominent Oregon businessman named D Hume built a steamer called the Mary D Hume. The timber vessel hauled cargo between Oregon and San Francisco for 8 years before serving as a whaling vessel in Alaska and then becoming a tugboat. Mary D. Hume was retired in 1977 after almost 100 years in service. She was towed back to her original home in Gold Beach, Oregon. In 1979, the ship was listed on the National Register of Historic Places despite being in a state of decay. Plans were made to turn the Hume into a museum, but the vessel slipped off the sling during transport and landed in the mud along the Rogue River. All the money that was meant to go into restoring it got squandered in an unrelated lawsuit, leaving the Hume to rot. Today, the vessel sits derelict on the shoreline. Number 8. SS St. Christopher. Originally named the HMS Justice, the SS St. Christopher was built as a rescue tugboat for the US Navy in 1943. But the American military never used the wooden vessel, which instead fell into the hands of the British Royal Navy. It was turned over as part of the Lend-Lease Act, which supplied food, oil, and military equipment to US allies. The St. Christopher was reportedly used in the 1944 Allied invasion of Normandy, famously known as D-Day. After the war ended, the tugboat was returned to the US Navy. Then it was sold to a private buyer for commercial use. The boat ran aground during the 1950s and sustained rudder damage and engine problems, and was grounded in the Beagle Channel at Ushuaia, Argentina. Nicknamed the End of the World, Ushuaia is famous for being the world's southernmost city. The partially submerged St. Christopher still sits where it was left nearly 65 years ago. It's now become a tourist attraction and is even lit up at night, but nobody is allowed on the heavily damaged boat for safety reasons, because it looks like it could finish sinking into the water any minute. Number 7. TSS Duke of Lancaster. Built in Belfast, Ireland in 1956, the TSS Duke of Lancaster was once a passenger ferry and cruise ship that shuttled commuters between Lancashire, England, and Northern Ireland. Its leisure destinations included the Scottish Islands, Belgium, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, and Spain. Cruise services ended during the mid-1960s when the ship was converted into a car ferry in order to keep up with competition. It held up to 1,200 passengers and 105 cars. A company in North Wales bought the Duke of Lancaster in 1979 with plans to turn it into an arcade called the Fun Ship. Local councils opposed the business, and it closed in 2004 amid ongoing legal battles. Subsequent owners faced similar problems and abandoned any plans they had made for the ship. The Duke of Lancaster has sat in the same spot for over 40 years now. It's rotting and has become an even bigger eyesore than it probably would be as a functioning business. The games left behind from the vessel's days as an arcade were sold and removed in 2012. Around the same time, local graffiti artists were invited to make their mark on the derelict ship. Presumably artwork is more attractive than rust and decay. As of now, there appear to be no future plans for the vessel. Would you like to see the Duke of Lancaster in person? Have you? Let us know in the comments below, and if you are liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Peter Iredale. Peter Iredale was a London-based businessman who named his 4-masted steel sailing vessel after himself. Built in England in 1890, the ship eventually made its way over to the United States. While sailing from Mexico to Portland, Oregon in 1906, the vessel encountered thick fog, strong gusts, and a rising tide. The captain, H. Lawrence, tried to steer the Peter Iredale away from shore, but it was grounded by rough seas and winds. A lifeboat reported to the scene and rescued the 27 people aboard, including 2 stowaways who had stashed themselves on the vessel. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. An inquiry absolved the ship's captain and crew of any blame in the incident and commended them for trying to save it. The hull sustained little damage and plans were made to retrieve it, but the weather remained hostile and kept delaying the salvage effort. The Peter Iredale began to list and got stuck in the sand as it languished. Someone purchased the salvaging rights in 1917, but never did anything with the ship. It's still there, sitting in the water as a shell of its former self. All that's left of the Peter Iredale are its bow and a few ribs and masts. Number 5. MS World Discoverer. The MS World Discoverer was a German-made cruise ship that went into service in 1974. Built to withstand frigid polar conditions, it was capable of navigating the harsh Northwest Passage and occasionally even went on Antarctic cruises. The durable vessel met its end in 2000 when it struck an uncharted reef near the Solomon Islands. Thankfully, a ferry responded to the captain's distress signal and rescued all the passengers. In the meantime, the ship began to list, so the captain grounded it in Roderick Bay to prevent it from sinking. Ever since, the World Discoverer has sat there, neglected as it slowly sinks. It's currently listing at 46 degrees and is practically laying on its side in the clear blue waters. Eventually, the vessel will inevitably end up entirely underwater. Time and the elements have taken their toll on the ship, which is rusting out and missing several windows. Several companies have tried to salvage the World Discoverer over the years, but on top of being damaged by Mother Nature, it was ransacked by locals during a violent civil war, and it was deemed not worth saving. The wreck has become a tourist destination, but it won't be visible forever. Number 4. SS Bachimo. The SS Bachimo was originally a German trading vessel. It was given to Great Britain as a World War I reparation before coming under the ownership of the Hudson Bay Company. The ship traveled regularly across the Atlantic between Scotland and Canada, trading with Inuit tribes. In 1931, the steel-hulled steamer became trapped by ice floes in the Canadian Arctic. The crew was forced to abandon ship and built a makeshift shelter nearby while they awaited rescue. They lost sight of it during a blizzard, and when they awoke the next morning, the Bachimo had completely vanished. The men simply assumed it had sunk, but an Inuit fisherman spotted the vessel a week later. It was too badly damaged to salvage, so the crew retrieved what cargo and belongings they could and abandoned it once again. Over the following decades, many people claimed to see the Bachimo, earning it the nickname of the Arctic Ghost Ship. It was last seen in 1969 off the coast of Barrow, Alaska, 320 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Then, 37 years after being left behind by its crew, the ship finally seems to have vanished. Nobody has reported seeing it since. Deserted ships don't typically hang around in coastal areas for very long. They're usually swept out to sea by currents or they eventually rust and sink. What's odd about the Bachimo is the length of time and frequency at which people reported seeing it. Even more strange is the conspicuous absence of a wreckage or any debris since it was last spotted. In a last-ditch effort to find the ghost ship, the Alaskan government began an official search for Bachimo in 2006. No traces of it have been found. Number 3. USS Orion. The United States has more aircraft carriers than any other country. One of them, the USS Orion, was built for the US Navy. It entered service shortly after World War II ended. The ship operated primarily in the Pacific until sometime during the 1970s. In 1966, 47 men tragically died in a fire on the ship when a magnesium flare was accidentally set ablaze. The Orion received 2 battle stars for its service in the Korean War and 10 battle stars for the Vietnam War. It was taken out of service in 1976. In 1995, it was sold for scrap, but the buyer didn't really do anything with it, and it was ultimately repossessed. During that time, the ship bounced around between different shipyards in California and Texas. The Navy eventually decided to repurpose the Orion by sinking it off the Florida coast as an artificial reef. It was towed to Pensacola, Florida in late 2004, where scientists performed tests to ensure that the ship wouldn't endanger human or marine life after being submerged. In 2006, Navy personnel sank the Orion in the Gulf of Mexico. After spending years aimlessly traveling from one shipyard to the next, the dilapidated vessel finally found its forever home. Nicknamed the Carrier Reef, it's one of the world's most popular diving sites. Number 2. BOS 400. South Africa's Maori Bay is home to a seldom visited wrecked crane barge called the BOS 400. It ran aground during a storm in 1994 while en route to Cape Town from Point Noire in the Republic of Congo. At the time, it was the largest floating crane in all of Africa. With no main engines of its own, the BOS 400 had to be towed from one location to the next. It was being pulled by the Russian tugboat Tigre, which was underpowered and ill-equipped to tow such a large piece of machinery. Consequently, the tow rope snapped and the barge crashed into some rocks. The crew radioed to Cape Town Harbor for help, and 2 tugboats were dispatched to the scene. But seas were rough, and they failed to connect to the BOS 400. All 14 crew members were airlifted to safety. After several failed salvage attempts, the BOS 400 was declared a total loss. It was left sitting among the boulders where it still remains to this day. Number 1. SS Crate Boom. During the 1930s, a concrete ship called the SS Crate Boom appeared in Ireland's River Moy in Ballina. It's been there ever since. The Crate Boom was built amid a steel shortage during World War I. It functioned as a shipping vessel for a short time before being taken out of service in the 1920s. In 1935, it was stripped of its reusable materials, leaving behind its concrete hull. The Ballina Harbor Commissioners bought what was left of the Crate Boom in 1937 with plans to sink it at the mouth of the River Moy as a sand barrier. But it was damaged and started taking on water during the journey from England. The hull sat underwater for the next 40 years until 1974, when it was refloated and moved to its current location. There are numerous local legends surrounding the Crate Boom's origins. Some people claim that it was built as a decoy to trick German Air Force bomber pilots, while others say that it was used to train World War I naval cadets. Another story says that the ship was used for transporting ammunition between England and France. But these are just rumors that have never been confirmed. Nevertheless, the Crate Boom is an iconic fixture in the local landscape. Thanks for watching! Which one of these abandoned ships was the coolest to you? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.